Hi, I'm Anna Ehrsam here for Battery Journal. Today I have the pleasure of meeting with Dr. Ben Goldman. He has recently published a very interesting book that I look forward to talking with him about, entitled Nature Breakthroughs. Um, and we will be talking about post-pandemic risk analysis, ecology, wellness, um, the environmental justice movement, and 4 dimensions of equality. Hi, Ben. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
I'm hoping you can introduce yourself to our audience.
Well, I go by the kind of catch. Well, I call myself Dr. Wild Ben Goldman because I'm a doctor, but I'm not a medical doctor. I have a doctorate in well, actually, it's in public administration, but my specialty is policy and environmental issues and data analysis. Um, and I'm wild because my latest venture, which is called Nature Breakthroughs, involves taking executives, entrepreneurs, and creative people into the woods for breakthroughs, where I teach what I call my nature breakthrough method and help people get unstuck and on purpose.
Interesting. So this is part of an extension of your book and research surrounding nature breakthroughs. And I think that there's also a deck of cards and a kind of a series of uh, um, things, rituals, meditations, tasks that people can engage in that go along with this book.
Well, I've been doing this for the past 5 years or so in an entrepreneurial fashion, and I've developed different programs which I've been experimenting with. One is called the Wild Call Weekend, which is a 3-day kind of deep immersion into nature, and I use some kind of tricks and tools there, including a deck called the Poho Poco deck that I designed. It's uh, a tarot deck and other things. And the book uh, was my actually. I spent the last, I consider myself kind of an expert of change. So I don't know, I'm not sure everything we'll talk about today, but the beginning part of my career, I focused on societal change, and that's where issues like risk analysis and environmental justice come in. And then as I grew in stature in that field, I was running organizations, and so I became an expert of organizational change, and kind of became known as a bit of a turnaround specialist in helping turn organizations around. And um, and then in this last period of my life, when everything kind of fell apart for me, I I dived deeply into personal change uh, techniques, and the book was really my attempt to just kind of think through carefully all the stuff I was absorbing, all the practices and kind of learning that I was absorbing on the personal change front, and how it relates to the rest of my life. And and so that's what the book is. It's a 500-page tome. It's a big thing, and so it's not maybe the most user friendly, but it has in it everything that I needed to say. And and so my programs are kind of ways of packaging that into smaller packages. I also experimented with something called the Campfire City, which were webinars that I did last spring, um, to kind of walk through this nature breakthrough method. And I haven't done it this year, but I did that. That was another thing, and I've got there are other things that I've done in relation to this,
Mhm.
including
And
one-on-one coaching and creating masterminds and things like that.
Mhm. And just while we're on the topic, where can people buy your book?
Amazon,
Mhm.
or I mean, that's the easiest. It's Kindle for like $7 or $8, and then the actual physical book, because it's a big book, and there's a lot of illustrations and visuals, and because a part of my career has been in the arts and working as a visual artist. I put a big emphasis on visual. There's as much emphasis on visual uh, ways of demonstrating what I'm talking about as there is words, and that's expensive to print. So that the book, actually, to buy the physical book is $99, but it's worth it, I think, because it's a beautiful book. And
It is a beautiful book, I can attest to that, and perhaps later I'll show, some of the visuals. I have the PDF, that you shared with me, and I've really been enjoying looking at the beautiful, color plates and graphics. Um,
and some of them relate to my pure visual art uh, work, but one of my, I think, fortes in quantitative stuff, and then my science work has been data visualization. So there's a fair amount of kind of graphic display of information, and I think that hopefully that'll be useful.
so graphic display or data visualization, as you said, that's very interesting, because I was noticing that there is so much information in the book, and yet it's very digestible. And so it seems you really do have this great ability to take a lot of information and make it um, sort of distill it and make it digestible and make it accessible, rather than just a lot of data or information, but rather make it something that is pleasurable to engage with, very engaging visually as a tool. I thought it was a good tool, with lots of really interesting um, chapter headings too. We'll have a chance to look at that. Um,
Well, it's great to hear. I've written a lot of books, and as I've gotten older, uh, I've tried to make my books more kind of personal and storytelling in nature. And so this one is kind of like a long, shaggy dog, with a very meandering kind of, but it's kind of like a long story. Um, but I'm glad to hear that it's digestible. That when I started my career, that was my focus, was taking complex social science and making it presentable so that the public could consume it. And that's how I kind of had a lot of success early in my life. Was I was able to produce fairly sophisticated quantitative studies, and then land them on the front page of major newspapers. And back then, the media, the kind of the big play, the most prominent places in media,
mhm.
because I was able to distill things like multivariate statistical analysis into a headline.
So, for instance, you were very, very active, and in fact, instrumental in helping to form the environmental justice movement. And you did that through um, doing just that, bringing together lots of data sets. Is that true?
Well, yeah, yeah. I mean, I did a study I think it was published in 1987,
Hmm.
for the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice. It was called Toxic Wastes and Race in the United States. And it was the first national study that proved that there was uh, that there was a discriminatory pattern in the geographic distribution of toxic waste of an environmental hazard in America, and it was very statistically significant, and it affected people of color and lower income. And that, it actually, when I look back, it didn't make it to the front page of the New York Times, but it made it into the New York Times. And I mean, and it had, I was doing a lot of different studies back then, and they were all fairly important. And including like one of them helped lead to the end of the expansion of nuclear power in Canada. Another one led to the precedent that uh, uh, the Reagan's Federal Election Commission sued me to prevent. I had a company called Public Data Access that provided access to government data, and we set up the precedent that provided access to congressional finance data that was overturned by the Citizens United thing decision, Supreme Court decision. So that led to a Supreme Court decision. I did tons of work on toxic wastes that led to, lots of policy and headlines. What else? A lot of things in this particular study was, it was important, but it ended up having more legs in a way than most of. It became more famous than anything else I did, and it led to a presidential executive order and changes in public policy nationally, internationally, locally, it created a whole social movement and a field of academic study. So, and it was, and that, and uh, my study was really kind of helped launch that. That prior to that, there were activist uh, uh, um, like protests, like in Warren County, North Carolina. I mean, there were local protests, but nothing had been done nationally to kind of, jump this to a national scale. And most of my work back then, well, I'm kind of proud of what I did. All of my work really was done in the service of activist organizations back then. So we started this company called Public Data Access, and it was really a kind of pioneering company, and we were hackers basically before that term existed, and we did it. We used all kinds of tricks to get data out of the government, and
But back then it was really data mining. You probably had to dig deep and physically go into places to look at archives. How were you finding your information?
well, I did everything.
Yeah,
I mean, probably all the same kind of tools that hackers use now.
yeah,
Um, I mean, one example that I'm really proud of is I reversed, like Army surplus stores. I don't know if they still exist. Do they?
yeah.
You can buy boots, right?
Mhm.
So, and stuff and backpacks, or I don't know, but I remember you could buy clothing, and there was a database that the Defense Department kept called DRMS. I remember that, Defense Reutilization and Marketing System, and it was basically a database they used to remarket all these Army surplus stuff. And um, uh, but I figured out, so I got my hands on that database. I think uh, above board through the Freedom of Information Act, because nobody thought twice about it, and I was able to reverse engineer and figure out how much toxic waste because the database had all of their waste streams, used clothing, food, but it also had barrels of toxic waste.
My
And
God.
I used that to prove that the United States military was the biggest producer of toxic waste in the world, and that made obviously major headlines, and so that's one example. But we used moles in the government.
Mm.
We, I had accounts that that I shouldn't have, but there were so many people in the government that liked what I was doing that nobody cared. We did a lot. I was an expert in filing Freedom of Information Act requests, so we did tons of that. We we I mean, we just and back then you understand it was uh, everything was line by line code. There was no graphic user interfaces, and most of the more sophisticated uh, uh, statistical work we did was done using mainframe computers and ancient software called things like COBOL and stuff. And
Mhm.
uh, there was the beginning of user interfaces for statistical stuff, but it was pre-internet. And
Sure.
sorry, so it was like there were magnetic tapes. I mean, it was
Sure.
you. I remember there was a when I worked out on a floor that was full of nonprofit organizations, and I was the first person to buy a personal computer. I had the first personal computer on the floor,
Yeah.
and I bought it myself. It was made by Sanyo, and I did it to write my first book, which was on the toxic waste industry. And at the time, to word process, they were using a machine called the Videc machine, which was actually made by Exxon. Although I think this was before Exxon was called Exxon. I think it was called Esso back then or something. But it was the Videc machine. I'm pretty sure it was manufactured by an oil company, and it had floppy disks that were like they were huge. They were like 8 inches by 8 inches or 12 inches by I don't know. They were save one page at a time. And if you changed it, where you added a line or something, you had to save the line and then save it to the next page. I mean, that's how things were done back then, and that
Mhm.
was sophisticated. That's what law departments used. That was pretty sophisticated stuff back then.
So, but you were on a mission, and what really inspired you to champion environmental justice? What was your modus operandi? What inspired you? What impelled you?
Well, I guess it's funny story in the sense when I first I got a I don't know where to begin. I finished college and I wanted to be a painter, you know. And I went home to West Philadelphia into my mother's attic and started painting pictures, which were these dreary self-portraits. I was totally isolated, and my stepmother got some appointment to a board or something, and so she couldn't go on the honeymoon that she and my father had scheduled. And um, and he was a scientist, and so he asked me if I would chauffeur him on his honeymoon because she couldn't go. And before I left, I applied for this internship at a think tank in New York City. And when I got back from my father's honeymoon,
Mhm.
I got the internship and I moved to New York. And my what I wanted to do was military research. That's what I started with. I did. Uh, I was interested in, well, fighting the military through economic research, and I did a lot of work involving the nuclear freeze stuff and weapon systems and military economics. And uh, the big question then was, well, what they were trying to prove was that it was the government invested in civilian made civilian investments like in infrastructure, like what's being talked about today. There's a better impact on the economy than if it invests in military infrastructure. Civilian infrastructure has greater multipliers through the economy, and but the truth is, even though these kind of liberal think tanks didn't really want to admit it, was, well, guess what the biggest multiplier effect of military spending is? Take a guess.
Arms manufacturing.
Well, that would be the primary economic impact, but guess what the biggest secondary the multiplier, how it ripples through the economy?
Um, I don't know.
Uh, Hospitality,
Oh,
because
interesting.
soldiers got to eat, they got to sleep.
Yeah.
And so what what all this economic research showed was essentially there really isn't that much difference. A dollar spent on the military is very similar to a dollar spent on anything
Yes.
in terms of its economic impact. I mean, that doesn't mean that there aren't that doesn't mean that building weapons has the same societal impact for goods and services. You know, but in terms of how its effect on the GDP, it's kind of a wash. And
Mhm.
so what happened was the work kind of dried up. There wasn't that much work in that field, and um, there was a they got, you know, this was back in the early days of the toxic waste legislation. There was they were starting to clean up abandoned toxic waste sites and starting to regulate operating toxic waste site. And this think tank had a book, well, had a program funded by some foundation or something, and they were looking for someone to work on it. And um, so I kept applying for jobs doing military research and couldn't get any. And they didn't really want me to
No.
work on this book, but it was like I was there and the job was there. So I was like, what the hell? I didn't even really want to do it. And what happened was everybody that was working on it quit because because back then the waste industry was completely infiltrated with the mafia, and so most of the people doing this research were scared off. And so what happened was I went from being an intern to the director of the project, and that's how I ended up writing my first book. And like I said, to do that, I found I had to get into this new world of computers, and I had to start manage. It was so much data. I had to figure out a way to manage the data, and so I started developing an expertise, kind of self-taught at the time, in but which led to, you know, graduate work. So I became, you know, got a doctorate in it, but in data analysis. And I had some colleagues. Uh, well, that ended up leading to my co-founding Public Data Access with two colleagues. I was at the time 25, and then one of my partners was a energy expert named Mike Tanzer, who was 55, and then the other guy was a guy named Jay Gould, who was 75, and he was an expert in a database expert, and he was really and partners in crime in this stuff. And I learned so I kind of learned a lot about uh, base databases. I became a database expert through the tutelage of Jay Gould, who was a statistician, um, and through Mike Tanzer, who was an economist, both of them PhDs from one from Harvard, one from Columbia. So they were super brilliant guys. And so we were basically three radical Jews in
Mhm.
New York City, and we were running this company. And so we were in a very unique position at that point where we were pretty much the only people in America, I guess, in the world that had our fingertips on the kind of diverse sets of both on the technology and the data sets that would be needed to prove this kind of interdisciplinary hypo-
Mhm.
test, this interdisciplinary hypothesis that involved data not only from the field of environmental regulation, but also from the fields of demographics and socioeconomics and the census. And so we were really uniquely positioned. In fact, we were the very first people to provide, to get our hands on. We were the first people in the we were the first members of the public, or the first people to provide to the public access to the 1980 zip code census by zip code. It was the first census ever to be produced by broken down by zip code, and we were the first people to get access to it because it was actually a kind of private public partnership that the government had at the time, and they allowed private companies uh, to fund the production of the zip code data, and in return for which they got private use for their own marketing purposes of the
Oh,
of
wow.
the United States Census for, I think it was like 6 months or something, and we were the first ones to get it after that, and anyway, so that's how we were the ones
Oh,
able to do this study.
that's really interesting. So you were, as you say, uniquely positioned to bring these data sets together with this sort of cultural, anthropological, socioeconomic information here, and then the flow of toxic waste.
Yeah.
Did I, did I put that nicely? Is that kind of what happened?
Yep, basically.
Mhm. Nice. And so in that, you were able to make this substantial link between uh, 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 kind of this kind of environmental justice as it related to um, people of color,
And, and
poor communities that were predominantly people of color.
well, both. It wasn't unique to uh, people of color, but
No,
it also affected the lower income communities
lower income.
that weren't necessarily people. Graphics work in America, although this is changing. Uh,
Right.
People of color are overrepresented among poor communities in America. But for until uh, people of color become the majority of the population, most poor communities will still be majority white. And so, in other words, there's an overrepresentation of people of color, but that doesn't mean they're the majority. That you understand? So in other words, if there's, I don't know, I don't remember the statistics, but let's say 14% of America is African American. I don't know if that's the real statistic. Um, it's not that you would have, 80% of poor communities would be predominantly African American. It's that instead of there being 14% of the poor communities being African American, you might have, let's say, 30% or of the communities would be African American, and that means it's double the expect they're double, the rate is double, and it's highly significantly disproportionate. But still, at 70%, in that case, 70% would still be white. You know,
Yes. 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 So then this really sort of launched the birth of the environmental justice movement, and it dovetailed with a civil rights or racial justice as it uh, connected to issues surrounding the environment and toxic waste, and how that was affecting the health and well-being of the people that lived in those communities, be they poor African Americans, Latino, or people of color, or Caucasian people, but the poor people in these communities. And this this brings me to today. And we all just have come out of or starting to emerge from the pandemic and quarantine and coronavirus. And um, the virus was affecting a disproportionate number of people of color, it seemed, many of them not having access to healthcare, and many not having access also then to vaccines, or um, sort of being forced into positions where maybe they were frontline workers or working in a grocery store. They had to, they weren't abstract symbol manipulators who could, like myself, work from home and teach on Zoom, which was a great commute for me and at a safe distance from the potential of being infected during a commute on the train, or with my students in the classroom. Um, so I wanted to talk with you about um, the pandemic and kind of risk analysis as it relates to ecology, wellness, environmental justice, and this sort of broader dimensions. And as you've called it, the four dimensions of equality. Can you talk about any of those?
Well, I mean, I could just say my research. By the way, one of the things I'm really proud of in that first study, which is kind of mind blowing for me to consider, is I think I was the first person ever to define what a person of color is using the United States Census in that study, because nobody else had it was like a different lens to look at the data from, that people up until then, most people wanted to see. Uh, anyway, the census is very complicated in terms of how it treats um, race and ethnicity, and nobody had kind of lumped everybody together, which is what I figured out the mathematics of how to do that, and now it's kind of commonplace. But my research after that, expanded to showing how the pattern that we found with a very specific industry, the toxic waste industry, could be shown in myriad, almost infinite numbers of cases involving, air, not just where the toxic waste sites are located, but which ones are cleaned up quicker, and where the higher fines are, and where the air pollution is, where occupational safety issues are, where I mean, it like, and obviously this continues to this day, um, uh, where life expectancy uh, is not equally distributed, and for many reasons, health care access is part of it, and the kind of racial ways in which the ways in which structural kind of racism in our society affects people life chances, from everything from wealth and education to mortality, and environmental, myriad environmental conditions. Um, so I think your question was it's just one. One of the studies I did, which I don't think was known as an environmental justice study per se, but it formalized in a way uh, the my approach, I guess, to doing this kind of research, was a study called Discounting Human Lives, and uh, Discounting Human Lives, Uranium and Global Equity, I think it was. And in that study, I think, again, I'm the only person to have done this, or at least I was at the time, and I doubt anyone, to kind of try to figure out the to kind of aggregate the full cost benefit risk, to do a complete kind of cost benefit risk analysis of the nuclear industry, global nuclear industry. I was hired by a consulting group uh, that was specialized in radioactive waste management, and they who were hired by a citizen activist group called the Northwatch Coalition Ontario, the province of Ontario, Toronto, and it turns out that Northern Ontario was the primary source for uranium in the post-war, well, during World War, from the beginning of the atomic age until Kazakhstan overtook it, I guess, in the 80, 90, actually, I don't know when, but in the last few decades, it's no longer the primary one. But there were all of these, as a result of all the uranium mining that took place in Northern Ontario, there were all these mill tailings, these mining wastes all over the forest in Northern Ontario. And, it's kind of remarkable. You go there and, it's this pristine forest that could just go on for hundreds and hundreds of miles. And in the middle of it, there's this like beach, because the mill tailings look like sand. and it's just this beach that goes all the way to the horizon, and it's just dead, uh, and it's a very, very, very low level of radioactivity is emitted from this massive. And what we showed. Well, bottom line, you can read the book. It's not the benefits did not outweigh the cost or risks in
Mm.
any way, or under except under the most optimistic scenarios. But under most kind of conservative and reasonable scenarios, they um, the costs and the benefits, the costs and the risks way outweighed the benefits, including millions of cancers and excess deaths over a very long period of time. So it's over thousands of years, because some of these isotopes are there kind of indefinitely.
Oh,
Some of these isotopes stay radioactive for as long as there will be life on Earth.
yeah.
And um, and so one of the things that I did was to kind of get my mind around the scale of this kind of human activity. Uh, I mean, it is mind blowing that in a single generation, we created waste products that will cause death and environmental impact, um, till the end of times, basically, no matter what we do. And in some ways, it dwarfs climate change as uh, in scale. It may not dwarf climate change certainly in temporal scale, but it may not dwarf it depending on what metrics you're using. But so the four dimensions you talk about is what I talk about in terms of, like, the easiest way I think to understand environmental justice is, and this is true of all kind of economic activity and technology, is it's really kind of about who controls the decision making. And what you can do is measure, like a generation or a group of people, will make the decisions, and you can measure what their economic and environmental, economic benefits, environmental amenities, environmental risks, environmental harms come to the group making the decision versus other life forms on various dimensions. And the four dimensions I talk about would be, there could be the social dimension. So, it could be, rich people are making the decision, or white people are making the decision, or whatever. And then you could compare the impact, and this is part of the work that I did, to other social groups, whether they be poor people or people of color, or women versus men, or younger babies versus, that's another thing people get. I mean, guess what the number one contributor to life expectancy is?
Childbirth.
Well, child death.
Birth.
What?
Birth. Probably more people die during birth.
It's the number one contributor to life expectancy is child mortality, infant mortality, not
Yes.
child,
Yes.
infant
Yes.
mortality.
Yes.
And so what happens in that first year of life has the biggest impact on mortality statistics and life expectancy of anything.
Huh.
And in the United States, just as an example of an environmental justice issue, the African American infant mortality is, I don't remember what the number is. It's in my book, but it's
Yeah.
multiples higher than for other races. It's atrocious, and it's worse than Albania, I think. I mean,
Yes, it's much higher than in many other countries. It's
Yeah.
really, it's like a third world country, essentially.
So that's an example of looking at across the social dimension. But there are other important dimensions, one of which I think is critical, which is the temporal dimension over time. So it could be, rich people today might be making decisions that are going to negatively affect rich people in 100 years from now. So it could be the same social group, but just it's when they were born, when they are alive, and climate change is an obvious thing that comes to mind when we think about that we're making decisions now, and also you can talk about like the debt
Yes.
and stuff like that. I mean, there are decisions that we make now that can have catastrophic impact after long after the decision makers are gone.
Yeah.
And so if you do not figure out a way to represent the voices of the unborn, their interests won't be represented in the decision making, and you're going to have highly inequitable and that's where the title of that book came from, Discounting Human Lives, because the way economists talk about the time value of money is discounting. And there's all kinds of economic ways of figuring out the time value of money and the time value of human lives and stuff like this. And it's super uh, uh, it's very consequential. And if you discount the future, you can do anything you want today and not care and justify it. So then that's two dimensions. And then another dimension would be, well, I know that one dimension would be, so you've got the social groups, I'm looking it up in the book. Oh, here it is. Oh, geographic. Obviously, there's geographic. So a lot of times you have, uh, an economic. I mean, what we did in that first study for toxic waste and race was geographic. As well as social, but it shows that there's geographic. There's a geographic distribution of impacts. So one area might benefit, and another area might uh,
Suffer.
yeah, and there might not be similar socioeconomics in the two areas, but you could have very different, uh, in my research, this stuff is really real, political stuff. Like we used to, they used to, for example, vent the nuclear reactors, and they could decide when they would vent the radioactivity. They could do it in the morning or at night. So we showed in one of our studies that they vented it when it went over the poor communities and away from the rich suburbs. When the wind rose, when the direction of the wind went the way they wanted it to. That's when they vented it. And then the fourth dimension, which is critical, is the cross species or the interspecies. So decisions that we make as humans can lead to the extinction of species or the destruction of habitat, or all those types of things, and of course those can come back to bite us. But that's to me, I think that's the most comprehensive way to look at the question of environmental justice. If you think of justice as kind of structures for human structures for creating like policy and rules that we think will have the fairest outcome, or however you want to measure progress or goals. I think that you need to look at it from that kind of a perspective. And I'm very gratified that that first study that I did led to a presidential executive order that President Clinton signed, where now any federal government spending has to go through an environmental justice filter. They're not using, as far as I know, they're not using the four dimensions of environmental equity that I just said in how they define it, but they're using that kind of a lens to evaluate policy now.
So what is the name of that book again that we can find this in, this four?
Well, that's kind of a technical book, but it's called Discounting Human Lives. Well, it's in Nature Breakthroughs.
Oh, it is. Oh, good.
I mean, I
Okay,
talk about it a little bit. If you want to go into more detail, it's in Discounting Human Lives,
okay.
Uranium, and Global Equity.
I'd like to just touch upon the four dimensions of equity a little bit more as it pertains to right now, as we've all really experienced it in terms of cross species or interspecies and geography, inter relationships in terms of deforestation and habitat loss and wild species then coming in contact with domesticated species and viruses jumping from wild species to domesticated and then to a human population and opening up, you know, uh, this potential for pandemics and you know, new viruses to be unleashed on the world. And that's exactly what happened, it seems, with coronavirus, and really, uh, you know, had devastating effects. You know, we all experienced it. We all know people who died probably because of it, or have been very much affected. We were all affected. Um, let's talk about um, how we might be able to start thinking about changing policy, because you know, you've been instrumental in shaping policy, uh, how we might be able to start changing behavior on a grassroots level, how we might start changing behavior on a interpersonal or personal level in terms of daily practice, well, maybe wellness practices, or even practices in terms of our relationship to our immediate environment and nature that might help us. Um, and I mean, it seems it's going to take, in terms of um, a change, a real systemic change in the way um, people relate to animals and to habitats. Um, you know, we people need to kind of recognize that there is this kind of this web, this interconnected web of life that we all are very much inextricably a part of, and we're all bound together in it. And so you can't buy exclusion from it. So even the banker and his bottom line, even though that wind blows one way during a certain time of the day, his grandchildren cannot buy immunity from the toxic radiation. So there needs to be some real change in terms of the way people perceive, you know, wellness, and it needs to happen, uh, uh, you know, from a planetary and global perspective, a wellness perspective from a planetary. And I think we need to start thinking about environmental justice and ecology in a global sense. And we are part of that ecology, and we are part of that environment. Can you speak to this?
I think you should ask too modest a question. What, I don't know. I wouldn't know where to
Anything.
begin. Let me think where I can jump into that. Well, for one, okay, so for one, I would just say that's all true. This the kind of discriminatory patterns we found that were happening in this country happen not only within countries but between countries, and so we export our waste, and different countries export their waste, and so parts of the world get dumped on more than other parts, and so that is all true. But in terms of like what can people do as individuals,
Yeah.
um, you know, um, I mean, there is a limit to the kind of individualist American consumerist approach to things. That I am a believer in in a mixed economy, that you need government setting the rules.
Mhm.
I mean, it's not just that I'm a believer. It's just it's not a belief. It's from my perspective, it's kind of like the evidence is overwhelming
Mhm.
that you need that there is. I mean, there's no such thing as capitalism without a legal system.
Mhm.
It doesn't exist anywhere. It can't exist. And just to have private property, you need a legal system. And so uh, I think you need a government that's an equal partner in the game, and that there's all different kinds of regulatory structures. I mean, and regulation has has in certain circles a bad name, but and it exhausts me at this point because I don't have the energy at my age to engage in those stupid arguments as far as I'm concerned, because
Mhm.
it's so I'm actually gratified to see what the current administration is doing compared to the last administration. Not that but the problem is if as soon as I say something like that, half the people in America stop listening. um so I don't know what to do about that, really, other than um that uh, this requires action at all levels. It requires you know individual responsibility, but that's not nearly enough. And there's only so much we can do as individuals. And it requires local government and city planning and smart design of local infrastructure, urban infrastructure, and regional infrastructure. It involves um, you know good state law and regulatory structure, and it involves good national. It involves bold and brave national policy, and it involves international. It requires international effort as well,
Mhm.
all of which is happening, and we can see it. I do think the scale of what uh, President Biden is doing is the kinds of things that we need. We need to move to uh, a non-carbon based energy system that's also, from my perspective, non-nuclear, given
Yes.
the risks of nuclear power that I'm aware of.
Mhm.
And but there that energy sources.
Mhm.
It's just that those risks aren't. There's no risk-free. There's always risks. It's just that some risks uh, can be are permanent and fatal, and other risks are manageable. And some are irreversible, and some are reversible and manageable. Uh,
Mhm.
so uh, say vote Democratic, but I mean, I can also tell you that I live in Hudson County, New Jersey, which is all Democrats, and they're all corrupt.
Mm.
Corrupt. I don't want to say the curse word that's in my mind. So I once ran for office here, political office, and I know what it's like to fight Democrats in
Mhm.
the street. I mean, literally, I had my election workers beaten up on election day. I've had rocks thrown through the
Mhm.
car through the windows of my running mates, and I've had threats.
Mhm.
I mean, I can't even tell you the stuff that I've seen uh, done by Democrats. So it's not like I'm some kind of have blind allegiance to it.
A party. Yeah. So in
Yeah,
your new book, you call a contemporary how to change guide. I'm
yeah.
sorry. In your new book, you call it a contemporary how to change guide based on ancient technologies of transformation. Uh,
Well, I mean, a lot of what I've focused on recently, and I think it's a topic for maybe a different conversation at this point, but it's more about personal growth and you know the connection between that and uh, how and public policy is, it's kind of they're not. They're kind of several steps removed from each other. But uh, I mean, here's what I can tell you: that having spent the first part of my life as an activist or an activist scientist, let's say, um, I burned out. I mean, it was hard.
Yeah,
I was fighting every day and
sure.
fighting people that were much better funded than me
Yeah.
and were spewing all kinds of nonsense and accusing me of stuff that was untrue and
Exhausting and toxic, really.
toxic and demoralizing and actually the fights came from places you wouldn't expect, like allies, and
Sure.
it's just it's hard. And at a certain point, I had to regroup and focus on myself and like heal myself. Now that hasn't led me to change the world, but I kind of went from trying to change the world as a young man to trying to make myself happier, kind of, or more. mm, I mean, what happened with me is I started just losing a sense of meaning in life, and that's the most toxic thing. I don't know if toxic's the right word, but that's deadly.
Hmm.
And I needed to find meaning again, and um, so that's where my kind of spiritual and self development work is focused on. Now that, of course, I think if a person has a healthy uh, frame of mind and lifestyle, um, I don't know if it means that they're more likely to have a better impact on the environment. Not necessarily, but it's possible.
I think potentially,
It's potentially, but
yeah,
I can tell you, I had a pretty unhealthy uh, lifestyle when I was an activist, and I did a lot of good for the environment.
sure. But you were also, I'm going to call you a kid. When you were 20 and you were fighting and you were really on a mission and you were living on, junk food. I don't know if you were, but if you were, you didn't have to maintain your organism in the same way, right? And you had more fight in you, perhaps. And now, you said the slings and arrows were affecting you, and the toxicity of the environment, quite literally, the toxicity of the waste and the personalities and the climate that you were involved in were wearing you down. I think everybody is experiencing that. So I think ultimately planetary wellness must start with the individual. I think it's essential. In fact, I think it's um, inextricably connected. In fact,
It
wellness.
it is, but um, yeah, it does seem to me. Well, it's hard to know. If I put my science hat, it's very hard to know. When I see people doing the kind of spiritual work that I do, there seems to be a fairly narrow band of political, socioeconomics and political. They seem to come from a fairly narrow
Hmm.
socioeconomic and political perspective,
Hmm.
and I don't know that, and I suspect that perspective existed prior to them doing the work on themselves.
Hmm.
So it's really hard for me to know that this kind of work does. I don't know actually.
Hmm. Hmm.
I mean, I'd like to think it, but if I put my scientist hat on, I got no evidence.
Hmm. Hmm.
Uh, People who agree with me politically are more. I mean, I also know plenty of very sharp uh, policy people who are are not at all evolved, you know, human beings in a kind of spiritual sense. And I know plenty of people who are evolved spiritually, who are kind of very they've kind of removed themselves from any kind of political, or they have a naive kind of virtue signaling type uh,
Mhm.
politics.
So in closing, I thought we should maybe touch upon something that is very significant to everyone and is a central part of everyone's wellness, and that is the importance of sleep and how significant and fundamental that is to wellness. And you
Well,
talk about that in your book.
yeah, I started the adventure of writing this book, and a lot of my books in the past, they were very uh, um, I kind of knew what they were structured, and they were more scientific, and this one was more of like an adventure where I didn't really know where I was going to go, and I didn't really know how I was going to start the book, and I don't remember how it I don't really remember how it started, but I ended up writing about sleep in the first chapter. And I mean, I loved writing this book because this book really was, it was like through the practice of writing that I came up with my most important insights that are in the book. It wasn't like, oh, I have something to say and then I wrote it. It was more like, well, let me just start writing and follow the trail that the pen takes me on. And that's kind of what happened. And sleep ended up being the beginning of the trail. And uh, um, and what I realized was that um, let me see if I can remember how I said it. Well, I would put it this way. Are you still there?
I'm here.
Yeah, because I see the book you put up there. Um, uh, all change happens when we're uh, asleep.
Mhm.
Do you believe that?
I think the subconscious mind plays a huge part in our um, in our lives, much more so than we know. And
Well,
so I'm willing to say, yeah, I bet it does.
it's pretty easy to state, which is, um, all learning is unconscious.
Mm,
In other words, if you know something,
mhm.
if you're conscious of knowing something, you already know it. You're not learning it. So once you know something, you're not learning.
Mm.
Learning is so it's not a conscious act. It happens it's subconscious.
Mhm.
So there's and this the whole chapter is about how uh without sleep well, first of all, we can't be healthy,
Yeah.
and we can't you can't uh you really well there's just so many ways that this is true. Like, you heard of like growth spurts, like when we're kids, right? Like when we grow, when does that happen?
Oh, it happens when we're sleeping. My daughter wakes up and I swear she's grown 2 inches.
And that happens,
Right. It really
right?
does happen. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's like a million examples of how important, how vital sleep is, not only to our metabolism but to our growth,
Mhm.
both in a physical and in a mental and spiritual and emotional
Mhm.
way. And it's also one of the things that our modern society um, doesn't value. There's no value kind of put on. There's no money to be made from sleeping. Although maybe there's products that you can sell people,
Yeah,
uh,
sleeping pills, if you're a sleep doctor. Yeah.
maybe. But I mean, what I'm saying is that most
Yeah.
of the cultural pressure is to minimize our sleep,
Mhm.
uh, and
Maximize your productivity.
maximize the amount of time we're awake.
Mhm.
I heard, I don't know where I saw this, but I thought it was really interesting, which is um, something like Facebook thinks it's competing with Apple and Google, right? But that's not its real competitor. That's not the real competitor. Who's it really competing with?
Yeah, sleep.
Sleep.
That is sleep. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've been polling my students for years, asking them about sleep and sleep disturbances. First of all, across the board, everyone is experiencing and has been experiencing sleep disturbances for years, pretty much, myself included. I don't know about you. I hope you sleep very well. And it turns out, I go further or ask a series of questions. We should do a study together and be more systematic about it. I need to be more systematic in gathering this data. But most people are sleeping with their phone by their head or by their bed. They're probably not turning notifications off. They're being alerted throughout the night, or they're picking up their phone, they're checking their phone, looking at social media. And it's, not only that, but the electromagnetic radiation alone is enough to cause disturbances in one's biorhythms. It's, this is a real problem. This is a pandemic.
Yeah.
I'm convinced of this. Yes, it's a real problem. We need to be able to turn off our devices.
Yeah. And it's hard. I mean, I suffered from insomnia for years back before I became my enlightened self. But
Mhm.
and then I have figured out how to defeat that. And actually now I'm working on a major art project that has caused me my form of unwellness, which is like
Mhm.
right now, which is carpal tunnel, and that has profoundly messed up my sleep.
Oh,
And so even once you think you have it figured out, still new things happen, and that's also part of aging. You gotta nothing ever stays the same.
well, firstly, I'm sorry to hear that, and we had talked about that before, the pain and discomfort, and I hope I hope that goes away, or you're able to manage that. But your totem that you're making is really quite impressive. It's quite an accomplishment too, and I can tell you're working incredibly hard on that. And that is not just a major undertaking, but it's hard on your body too. I mean, that is a lot of vibration or pounding. You're carving, and there's probably a lot of sanding involved, and handwork. So I hope you're able to wrap that up soon.
Yeah. Well, I mean, usually I'm a painter, and I'll definitely go back to
Yes.
being a painter. This
Yeah.
has been an interesting kind of return to something I used to love to do when I was a child, but my 60-year-old body is screaming at me not to do it. And it has I'm hoping to finish it, but when you say I'm working hard on it, uh, I guess the hard part is it's becoming toxic for me. And so
Uh,
the hard part is figuring out, like, I want to finish. I don't want to just stop. I've been working on it now for months. And the hard part is calibrating, like how to do this. Like, I'm entering this 2 week or 10-day sculptural workshop,
mhm.
and half of me doesn't want to go because uh, I don't want to actually sculpt right now. I want to actually take 2 weeks and not do anything so
Yes.
my hands can heal. But I'm scheduled to do this thing, and so it's balancing, and this is what a lot of what we've been talking about. It's about getting things back. It's about balance.
Yes. And also maybe working within our limitations or the parameters that can work for us.
Yeah, and
And
some of it is some of it is becoming more attuned to natural uh, rhythms and flows and stimuli, and part of it also in this day and age is taking advantage of technology that can, that can improve situations. I mean, if we, I'm not a Luddite. Uh, I'm very kind of interested in technology, and my work from the very beginning has been highly technical. But it's about being it's about learning how to carefully use technology to help us expand beyond limits that we used to have without damage, within a kind of ecological context that makes sense.
Mhm. Well, I hope you're able to find a, a space where you can complete your project, and it feels satisfying and complete, and you find some relief from the pain that I know you're feeling. So that's
Part of me just wants to hire some young summer student and
well,
say,
you
here,
probably
here's
should
here's the sander.
stand
I'll
this.
just watch you do it.
Well, no, that's the way to do it, probably. Yes. Well, from what I saw, I thought it looked really great, and you could probably just step away now, frankly, and let it be what it is for now,
Well,
and just and exercise a certain kind of acceptance for what it is.
no,
Let
there's more to be done. There's more to be done.
it. Well, on that note, my friend, thank you so much for joining me for part one, and I look forward to part two.
Me too.
Part two of our conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anna.
We'll talk to you soon. Be well.
Okay, bye bye.
Be well. Bye bye.